Bring my floors.
So, it's time to look at those Zelda CDI games, huh? More specifically, the two that spawned thousands of YTPs.
Scrubbed all the floors in Hyrule. Scrubbed all the floors in Gamelon. Scrubbed my ship in the morning. Scrubbed my boy.
When I decided to take a look into these, I was often asked if I would also take a look at the third game, Zelda's Adventure. I've glanced over at that game before, and even as a joke, I see no appeal in covering that one. There's a reason people love to hate these first two games. It has a so bad it's good approach from many. An amateur dev known as Dopply released fan remastered versions of the original two games, which got quite a bit of attention in late November of 2020. The games are infamous for many reasons, and probably the most rational complaint would be the way the gameplay was designed. It was unfair, confusing, and filled with strange ideas that didn't complement the experience at all. This remaster aimed to fix a lot of those problems, so my perspective currently is based on these improved experiences. True, there are two modes of play here in the remaster. You can play the old style or remastered style, but either way you're still going to be missing out on a lot of things that added up to the hatred for these games. The controller, frame rate, and probably multiple other things that I'll discover upon playing it on genuine hardware, which let me tell you hasn't been the easiest thing to pull off. I made a video documenting the unfortunate reality of using a CDI in 2020, and that'll pull up in a card now if you'd like to hear more about how that went. You might be wondering how Philips got Zelda games on their CDI platform. In short, there were some ideas surrounding a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo at one point, which Nintendo looked to Sony for support with. When that fell out, they instead turned to Philips. That also fell out, however their contract went far enough to let them use some of Nintendo's IPs for their own games. Philips decided to go with Super Mario and Zelda. There are many videos about this story which do a far better job than I would trying to explain it, so let's move on to Link: The Faces of Evil as remastered by Dopply, played in the remastered gameplay setting. So you start the game and...
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
My boy.
Yep, I mean, what can you really say about these cutscenes today? They look as if someone was really fond of MS Paint's pencil tool, but considering the difficulty of animating such a thing, would frequently have it so the perspective would zoom into the faces of evil, the characters' faces, that is. You know, there's less to animate that way. I mean, it sure is weird, but I don't know if I'd ever say it looks bad. It's very exaggerated, and sure, the perspectives can be pretty bizarre, but this always felt more to me like a style than a lack of talent. It is a far cry from the game's art style otherwise, though. I'd say it looks akin to other 2D games of the time, but with a larger emphasis on hand-drawn art. It all blends together quite nicely. I'd go as far as to say the traditional game at a standstill looks pretty good. In movement, meh. The animations are basically composed of 3 sprites per enemy in any direction, give or take some idle frames. Nothing impressive, but not bad. I must, however, admit that the game's soundtrack is impressive. Each stage has a unique track associated with it, even for the shorter ones. When I was streaming this game, one of the most common comments I saw were related to the music. Everyone seems to agree, whether this fits as a Zelda soundtrack or not, it's pretty dang solid. But I guess that's fitting for the once outstanding CD quality audio a la CDI. The first thing you're given is a map selection screen where you can choose between 3 different locations to explore. Use your sword to eliminate the beasts of the land and get rubies as a reward. People often criticize the game for saying rubies instead of rupees, as the Zelda universe is meant to deal with rupees instead, but whatever. There's an area up ahead that's too dark to see, so you need a lantern. Naturally, I head on over to the shop on the far left of Goronu. You can buy lamp oil, rope, bombs. I want it, but no lantern. You have to head on over to the Toiku Lighthouse first, which you can't go to yet until you fulfill certain linear quests in the available worlds. This is how you'll go about unlocking the remaining worlds, even though there's nothing really stopping Link from going there himself. Just the game doesn't let you until prerequisites are met. It's a linear story, but you can freely explore whatever places you've unlocked. So yes, this takes the traditional Metroidvania approach you're all no doubt familiar with, and I feel, for what it is, this was surprisingly quite decent. You can consult Gwonum at any time for a hint on where the game expects you to go, or what to do next. In terms of getting lost or stuck, the Faces of Evil handles this pretty well. For example, this one part near the start where you have to hit this skull with your sword to get a key to unlock the door immediately next to it.
Dyras came straight from the crater till I boarded the vent. Used a skull for a latch and not one Dyras figured it out.
Anyways, you better figure it out somehow because it's essential to unlock the next room where you'll exclusively be able to farm Firestones. Why do you need Firestones? Well, certain enemies can only be destroyed with those, including 1 or 2 of the game's bosses. I say bosses loosely. Unless you're required to get at them with a specific inventory item, you just hit them with your sword 5 times, give or take. Not like the inventory changes much, just use the specific thing to hit them with, and it should take them down easily. This actually includes the final boss. These are the most underwhelming bosses I've ever encountered in a video game. They're honestly less threatening than the average grunt. To select an item, you have to open your inventory menu, which is the same button used to enter a new location. This is bothersome, because it means I have to walk forward a bit as I enter a new place, so as to not trigger that entrance I just walked in from. Why is that such an issue? Well, it would be a nitpick if it were any other game, really. In Faces of Evil, however, this puts the player at a severe disadvantage given the absurd amount of trickery this game throws at you. Flying enemies can spawn in from practically nowhere. Level obstacles are all over, like ice falling from ceilings, rocks descending from a nearby cavern. Often you'll find enemies throwing axes from above or below your position, which are next to impossible to dodge. In these situations, it can also be pretty difficult to determine how to get from one ground to another. I think the hand-drawn art can cause confusions with this, especially in mountainous locations with rocks that aren't designed distinctly enough to visually demonstrate where the character needs to stand. Oh, I should mention Link does have his shield to block enemy attacks, but this is just short of pointless. You have to be standing completely still for it to work. Even then, if the problem in question isn't immediately direct to Link's shield position, it won't work and you'll take a hit anyways. As you get pummeled by the game's many hazards, you'll find there are no invulnerability frames. So as the game is throwing multiple threats at the player, you can expect to lose a huge portion of your health in just a second. This is far worse at the start of the game where you have only 3 hearts. Each heart is worth 2 hit points, but even that is nowhere near enough. What's funny is how the game remains pretty much identical in difficulty otherwise, so it's really just the start of the game that's a problem. You have unlimited retries, at least in remastered mode, so while it can get frustrating to repeat certain sections, I wouldn't say that's a flaw of the game since every area is pretty short. I guess the worst aspect there is losing your farmed resources. Going back to get more firestones or snowballs can be annoying, but it's such a short process, I'm not losing any sleep over it. Succeeding at the game's instructions will often reward you with an item that has been referenced by another character earlier on. Now your job is to revisit the location you met this character at to give it back to them. This is how you'll get new upgrades like a sword that shoots, or maybe the power glove which can replace bombs at the cost of 10 rubies per use. Very effective for removing boulders, which, oh geez, these boulders, they can be so vague. Had I played this game as a kid, I would have given up at one of these boulders that takes like 10 bombs to destroy. It doesn't seem as if you're really doing anything to it until eventually, yep, it's gone. As I said before, other than these strange design choices, the game is understandable, but you'd still find there are other negatives beyond that. I found climbing ropes and ladders can be very specific to where you're standing. In a dire situation, it can mean life or death. The animation is a bit off-put as well. While I think the hitboxes are fair, enemy placements and hazards are not. There are even some situations where you'd swear going out unscathed is impossible. The audacity behind some of these spawns is ridiculous. On some occasions, I'd even find enemies spawning out of thin air. All I can say is, this is the fan remastered edition, and you have unlimited lives. The nonsense is a reminder of how bad this would have been in the 90s, but now, it's just an annoyance that could have been dealt with. Frankly, I don't think the author wanted to radically fix the game. It feels more like a preservation effort. A remaster, sure, but I think that term should be used loosely. Perhaps the best way to look at it is like a PC port of the original game that works on modern operating systems, just now with some few, but much needed quality of life adjustments. But if there's one thing that really frustrates me, it's the resolution of the game. This thing is tiny. I had to use my capture software to blow it up in order to even see the thing properly. I've heard this thing was developed in Game Maker, so perhaps that's a limitation of the software? But either way, I hope eventually someone finds a way to at least expand the window size of this thing. Link the Faces of Evil, at least in its remastered form, isn't horrible, but far from great. I'll return with a summary of both games at the end of this video. Now it's time for the second game, Zelda Wand of Gamelon. The way this game plays is identical to the last one, so I'll save some redundant comments. Funny story, I completely forgot about the options going into this one. It had been a couple weeks between my playthrough of this and Faces of Evil, so I accidentally played through about half of this one on the original settings. That's also why there are now subtitles on the cutscenes as they're enabled by default, something of which was actually new to the remasters. Something else that was new to the remasters is the Impa's Wisdom screen. I barely mentioned this mechanic in the last game because while it is useful, I didn't think it was entirely necessary in Wand of Gamelon, however. So this alert screen can be brought up to display the Impa screen. It gives you hints about what you're going to do next, and you're going to need to pull this up often because especially in comparison with the last game, Wand of Gamelon can be pretty cryptic in what you're supposed to actually do to progress the game. Whereas in Faces of Evil you'd often have one main goal to accomplish at any given time, this one will have multiple boss characters sitting in limbo once you've discovered them, only for you to come back much later after getting something specific needed to dispose of them. But it isn't just boss characters, it's also locked doors or locations with invisible enemies that you can't progress past without backtracking. That's fine, but not when you're given half a dozen of these scenarios all at once to be considered. This is the kind of thing that I'm sure isn't a big deal for some, but personally, as someone with a bit of an underdeveloped attention span, yeah, this is an issue to say the least. How about this time you have to fling your sword at this portrait to get the key required for opening this door? This time it's actually more comprehensive than in Faces of Evil. There's a cutscene that tells you about it pretty directly.
Duke Onclid betrayed the king!
I know.
Strike the head of the portrait to enter Onclid's chamber.
Thanks.
Unfortunately, when I was streaming the game, I accidentally pressed a button and skipped it.
Duke Onclid betrayed the king!
Okay, in Faces of Evil you can just talk to the character again, but in Wand of Gamelon, the dude's gone. At least you can use Impa's wisdom, but if this were on the original hardware, well, I'd be boned. There are a few instances like this scattered throughout the game. That one was the worst for me, though that's just because of my bad luck, I guess. Wand of Gamelon has a lot more hazardous nuisances as well, like this one tower with rocks that constantly fall on you. Sure, Faces of Evil had its weirdness that I can't excuse, but this time it's just overkill. I've been told that this game was more rushed over the other, and it absolutely shows. Perhaps nothing more so than the environments. Everything looks far more like a painting than ever before, which as far as I know was the case for both games. But at least in Faces of Evil, they felt like they were drawn to be explored. Wand of Gamelon seem more like they belong in a gallery. I mean, there's this one forest scene, for example, that is clearly struggling to be played. Overall, Wand of Gamelon suffers from the same issues Faces of Evil does, but the crap factor is amplified in many places. That being said, it also has the same strengths. The music is great. The music is great. It is most definitely a video game, so that's a compliment. And those were 2 of the 3 infamous Zelda CDI games. Link the Faces of Evil is a troubled game with some redeeming factors. If you can't enjoy it for that, perhaps you can have a good laugh at the so bad it's good nature of it all, especially considering its wild history. It's not an awful game, but I wouldn't say it does anything particularly well beyond its decent world exploration and soundtrack. Zelda Wand of Gamelon is a far less polished game, which is a harsh reality knowing the first game wasn't much of a hit either. With a new difficulty curve, cryptic progression, and a rough presentation overall, this is one I can't recommend even for laughs. Now that the remasters have finally been reviewed, we can move on to playing these 2 on a real CDI, something I will surely enjoy and not regret in the slightest. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch all you frame raiders in the next video.